Story number 1. Final call. Minneapolis in the winter is a special kind of hell. Not the fiery, Dante's Inferno kind of hell, no, this is the frozen variety, where the cold seeps through the cracks of old windows, burrows under layers of clothes, and settles deep into your bones. The wind howls through the empty streets, carrying tiny daggers of ice that sting your skin and remind you that you don't belong out there. Most people would do anything to avoid leaving their warm homes during a cold snap like this. Unfortunately for me, my job didn't allow that luxury. I worked the night shift at a customer service call center in one of those glassy high-rises downtown. The company itself was forgettable, one of those faceless corporations that handle everything from insurance claims to late-night tech support. I'd taken the job because it paid slightly better than my last one, and I thought I'd enjoy the quiet solitude of working nights. Fewer people, less drama. I was wrong. The building was mostly empty by the time I arrived for my shift at 10 p.m. A skeleton crew worked the earlier part of the night, but they usually clocked out by 11, leaving me as the sole inhabitant of the 14th floor. The office was massive, rows of cubicles lined up like a maze, with fluorescent lights humming overhead. My workstation was near the far end, close to the break room. I shrugged off my coat, hung it on the back of my chair, and settled into my desk. The monitor glowed faintly in the dim light, the system booting up with its usual sluggishness. I checked the schedule. 3 calls on the queue. Easy enough. Most people didn't call this late unless they were desperate or bored. The first couple of hours passed uneventfully. A tech support issue for a printer here, a billing question there. I sipped coffee from my thermos, scrolling mindlessly through social media during the lulls. The white noise of the building's heating system filled the silence. Outside the windows, the city was a ghost town, streetlights reflecting off the icy sidewalks. At around 1:30 a.m., the phone rang. The sound startled me, cutting through the quiet. I glanced at the screen, no caller ID, just the word unknown. That wasn't unusual, people sometimes called from private numbers. I hit the button to answer. Thank you for calling customer care. This is Laura speaking. How can I help you? For a moment, there was nothing. Just static. Hello? I tried again, leaning closer to the headset. Then, faintly, a voice. It was low, barely above a whisper, and difficult to make out over the crackling noise. Hello? I repeated, louder this time. They're coming. The voice sent a shiver down my spine. It was raspy, like someone speaking through clenched teeth, and the words were barely audible. Excuse me? Who's coming? You need to leave, the static surged, drowning out the rest. I frowned, my skin prickling. I think you have the wrong number. This is a customer service line. Get out now. The words came sharp, cutting through the static. Then the line went dead. My pulse quickened as I pulled the headset off. Prank calls weren't uncommon, but this one felt different. It wasn't funny. It was wrong. I glanced around the empty office, the rows of cubicles stretching into the dimly lit distance. The hum of the fluorescent seemed louder now, the shadows between desks darker. I shook it off, telling myself it was just some late-night weirdo with too much time on their hands. An hour later, I was answering a call about a warranty when the lights above me flickered. Just for a moment, but enough to send a ripple of unease through me. The power in this building wasn't great. It wasn't the first time I'd seen the lights glitch. Still, it felt different tonight. After finishing the call, I stood up, stretching and shaking out my nerves. The office was eerily silent, save for the occasional groan of the building settling against the cold wind. I decided to grab a snack from the vending machine in the break room. As I rounded the corner, I noticed something strange. One of the phones from another cubicle sat on the floor in the middle of the aisle, the cord coiled like a snake. I stopped, staring at it. Phones didn't just fall like that. Especially not in the dead of night when no one else was here. I crouched, picking it up. The base was cold, heavier than I expected. My gaze darted around the room, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the same empty cubicles and flickering lights. With a sigh, I returned the phone to its cradle and continued to the break room. The vending machine's harsh fluorescent light buzzed as I fished a dollar bill from my pocket and fed it into the slot. The machine made an angry clunk, spitting the bill back at me. "Of course," I muttered, smoothing it out and trying again. As the machine whirred, a loud thud echoed from the hallway. I froze. It wasn't the faint creak of the building or the distant hum of a heater. It was something deliberate, heavy, like a door slamming shut. I poked my head out of the break room, peering into the dim hallway. Nothing. The elevator doors at the far end were shut, their digital displays showing no movement. The exit to the stairwell was closed too. Shaking my head, I returned to my desk, telling myself I was just tired. It was just after 3 a.m. when the phone rang again. Unknown. I hesitated. My finger hovered over the answer button, a strange dread settling over me. Finally, I pressed it. "Thank you for calling customer care. This is Laura speaking." "Leave," the voice interrupted, sharp and clear this time. "You have to leave now. They're here." My breath caught. The voice was the same, a low, rasping whisper, but this time it felt closer, as if whoever was speaking was in the room with me. "Who is this?" I demanded, trying to steady my voice. Static. Then, "The back room, check the back room." "What? What are you talking about? Who's?" The line went dead. A chill raced down my spine. I yanked off the headset, standing so quickly my chair tipped over. The back room? The stockroom where we kept old files and spare equipment? I debated calling someone, security, the police, but my phone had no signal and the landline was tied to the same network as the call system. I was alone. The thought of checking the back room made my stomach churn, but the idea of ignoring it felt worse. What if someone was back there? The hallway leading to the back room was darker than the main office, the overhead lights dimmer here. My footsteps echoed as I approached the heavy door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of shadowed space visible through the crack. I pushed it open with trembling fingers. The room beyond was a cluttered storage space filled with filing cabinets, cardboard boxes, and old computer monitors. The air was colder here, carrying a faint metallic tang. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. But then I saw it, on the floor, in the center of the room, was my cell phone. I hadn't brought my phone here. I hadn't even taken it out of my bag since arriving. It buzzed, vibrating against the concrete floor. The screen lit up, displaying 2 words, "Final call." I backed away, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But before I could turn, the lights in the room cut out completely. In the pitch black, I heard them. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, approaching from the hallway. My breath hitched. They weren't the footsteps of a single person. There were multiple, all moving in an unnervingly synchronized rhythm. I fumbled for my phone, the glow of the screen illuminating my shaking hands. The words on the display had changed, "They're here." A low whisper filled the room, rising from every corner. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was menacing, suffocating. Shadows moved at the edge of the dim light, figures coalescing from the darkness. I backed into a filing cabinet, heart pounding, eyes darting for an escape. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony. The figures moved closer, indistinct but undeniably human-shaped. Then, one voice cut through the noise, "Laura." My name. The shadows surged forward, and I screamed. I don't remember running, but somehow, I made it back to the main office. The lights flickered wildly, casting strobe-like flashes over the empty desks. The phone at my station was ringing incessantly, the screen flashing unknown caller. I didn't stop. I grabbed my coat and bag, sprinting for the elevator. As I hit the button repeatedly, the whispers echoed behind me, growing louder. The shadows pooled at the edges of the hallway, creeping closer. The elevator doors finally opened, and I stumbled inside, jamming the close button. As the doors slid shut, I saw them, dozens of shadowy figures filling the office, their faces blank but their eyes glowing faintly. The last thing I heard before the doors sealed was a whisper, "We'll see you soon." I quit the next day. Jerry called to ask why, but I couldn't explain it, not in a way that made sense. The police found nothing when I reported the incident. No shadows, no evidence of intruders. Just my cell phone sitting in the back room, its battery drained. I've since moved to another city, far from Minneapolis. But sometimes, late at night, my phone rings, no caller ID, just unknown. I never answer. Because I know who's calling. Story number 2. The figure in the snow. Working nights in the Widener Library at Harvard University was a dream job on paper. A hushed, labyrinthine temple of knowledge, filled with the scent of aged parchment and the promise of discovery. As a research assistant, my job was to catalog rare manuscripts, verify citations for faculty projects, and occasionally retrieve items from the special collections. The work required solitude and focus, qualities I've always prided myself on. But no one warned me how unsettling the place could become after dark. It was mid-January, and a storm had rolled into Cambridge earlier that evening. Snow piled in thick drifts against the arched windows, and the wind howled across Harvard Yard, rattling the glass. Inside, the library was an island of stillness, its grand reading rooms lit by pools of golden light. The towering shelves cast long shadows, the kind that seemed to move if you stared at them too long. I was alone on the 3rd floor, tucked into a corner of the rare books room. Widener wasn't technically open this late, but researchers like me had privileges to stay after hours. It was a perk I usually relished. The silence helped me focus, the absence of undergraduates chattering on their phones was a gift. That night, though, the quiet felt oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't really alone. Around midnight, as I finished logging an inventory of 16th century theological texts, I noticed something out of place. A book lay open on the long oak table at the center of the room. I didn't recall putting it there. It was a thick, leather-bound volume with cracked edges and no visible title. I stepped closer, frowning. The book seemed older than anything I'd been working with that night, its pages yellowed, the ink faded to a sepia hue. The spine had an unreadable inscription in some archaic script, one I didn't recognize. Strange, I muttered to myself. My inventory didn't list anything like this. As I flipped through the pages, my unease deepened. The text was handwritten, the language indecipherable. I recognized elements of Latin, but the syntax was fragmented, jumbled with glyphs and symbols I'd never seen before. Then I noticed something else. A note had been scrawled across the bottom of one page, written in what looked like dried blood. Don't look at the window. The handwriting was erratic, the letters jagged and slanted. My stomach tightened. A prank, maybe? One of the undergraduates sneaking in and trying to be clever? But who would deface an artifact like this? I glanced at the window instinctively. Snow swirled outside, the glass fogged from the difference in temperature. Beyond, the storm blurred the world into a shapeless expanse of white. Nothing unusual. Still, the note unsettled me. I closed the book and moved it to the corner of the table, telling myself I'd report it to the head librarian tomorrow. About an hour later, as I typed up my report, I heard it. A faint knock. It was soft, deliberate, coming from the far side of the room. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. It came again, a steady tap tap tap, like knuckles rapping against glass. The room's windows stretched high above the floor, arched at the top and bordered by thick wooden frames. They overlooked Harvard Yard, though from the 3rd floor, the view was limited to the tops of trees and the snowy expanse below. I swallowed, staring at the nearest window. The frost on the glass shimmered faintly in the dim light, but there was nothing beyond. Just the storm. Tap tap tap. It sounded closer this time. My chest tightened. The logical part of me knew it couldn't be someone actually knocking, it was 3 stories up. The windows didn't even open. It had to be a branch or maybe ice cracking in the wind. Still, I stood and walked to the center of the room, my heart pounding. Don't look at the window. The words from the book echoed in my mind. I hesitated, feet rooted to the carpet, torn between curiosity and dread. Finally, I turned my back to the window and forced myself to focus on my work. I didn't want to be the fool in every horror story who makes the wrong decision. But the knocking didn't stop. After what felt like an eternity, I couldn't take it anymore. The sound was incessant, each knock more insistent than the last. I had to know. I turned slowly, my breath hitching. At first, I saw only my reflection in the window's frosted pane, a pale face, wide eyes, hair slightly mussed. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something outside. A dark shape stood in the snow below, stark against the white landscape. It was a figure, tall and unmoving, draped in a long, tattered cloak that flapped faintly in the wind. Its face was obscured by a hood, but I could feel its gaze. Even from this distance, I felt its attention, heavy and intrusive. A shiver crawled down my spine. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, framed by the swirling snow. My rational brain screamed at me to turn away, to walk back to the desk and pretend I hadn't seen it. But something about it held me in place, as if my body refused to obey. Then, in the corner of my eye, I saw something on the security monitor. The rare books room had a small security setup, just a single camera feed mounted in the corner of the room, its display embedded in the wall behind the desk. The monitor flickered as I turned to it, static rippling across the screen. At first, I thought it was malfunctioning. But then I saw it. On the screen, the figure wasn't outside. It was inside. Standing directly behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. My breath caught in my throat, my heart hammering. But the room was empty. The table, the shelves, the carpet, everything was exactly as it had been moments before. Except for the book. The leather-bound volume I'd set aside earlier was now open again, lying in the middle of the table. The same page stared up at me, its bloody scrawl glaring under the harsh light. Don't look at the window. I don't remember much about the next hour. My memory blurs, fragments of panic and icy dread mixing into a haze. I remember pacing the room, checking every corner, every shadow. I remember trying the door to the rare books room and finding it locked, though I hadn't locked it. The figure outside didn't move. The monitor continued to glitch, static rippling across the image. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of movement, shadows shifting in ways they shouldn't, shapes that didn't belong. And then the lights began to flicker. It started faintly, the fluorescence dimming in and out, casting the room in strobe-like flashes. The shadows seemed to deepen with every pulse, stretching unnaturally across the walls. Somewhere, distantly, I heard the knocking again. But this time, it wasn't from the window. It was from the door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The knock was soft, almost polite, but insistent. Tap, tap, tap. Hello? I called, my voice trembling. Who's there? No answer. I approached the door cautiously, my steps slow and deliberate. My reflection in the glass pane of the door looked back at me, pale and terrified. The knock came again, louder this time. When I was close enough to reach the handle, I stopped. My hand hovered over it, fingers trembling. Something in my gut screamed not to open it. The knocking stopped. Then, from the other side, a voice. Let me in. It wasn't a question. The voice was low, raspy, and laced with a hollow quality that didn't sound entirely human. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a chair. Who are you? What do you want? Silence. The lights flickered violently now, the monitor buzzing with static. On the screen, I saw the figure again, standing in the middle of the room, its head tilted slightly, as if observing me. But when I turned, the room was empty. I don't know what finally gave me the strength to move. Maybe it was survival instinct, maybe sheer desperation. But I grabbed my bag, flung open the door, and ran. The hallway outside was dim, the emergency lights casting a faint red glow. The air was colder here, each breath forming clouds in front of me. I didn't stop to think. I bolted down the corridor, past rows of locked doors and empty study rooms, the sound of my footsteps echoing unnaturally. Behind me, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, following me. I didn't dare look back. When I reached the main staircase, I took the steps 2 at a time, nearly slipping on the polished marble. The lobby was dark, the storm outside making the windows rattle. I burst through the front doors into the freezing night, the snow blinding me. The cold air burned my lungs as I stumbled across the yard, my only thought to put as much distance as possible between me and that building. I never went back to Widener Library. I quit my position the next day, citing personal reasons. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not really. Who would believe me? But sometimes, late at night, I think about the book. The warning scrawled across its pages. And the figure in the snow, staring up at me from below the window. I don't know what it wanted. I don't want to know. Story number 3. Echoes in the Sky. I'd always enjoyed working alone. The solitude of the mountains, the quiet hum of old machinery, it all suited me perfectly. The abandoned radar base perched on a peak in the Rockies was about as remote as it got. The Air Force decommissioned it decades ago, leaving behind a skeleton crew of engineers to maintain its minimal operations for historical preservation. I'd been stationed there for 6 months, pulling lonely night shifts to monitor the equipment, though nothing ever really happened. Or at least, nothing was supposed to happen. But then, one winter night, something did. The base, a sprawling relic of Cold War paranoia, was a maze of dusty control rooms, endless corridors, and rusting radar towers. Most of the equipment was useless now, stripped for parts or rendered obsolete by modern technology. My job was to ensure the structural integrity of the building, keep the lights running, and occasionally tinker with the remaining radar system, an ancient behemoth that hadn't been powered on in years. That night, the snowstorm outside howled with a fury I'd never heard before. The wind shrieked as it battered the base, and the power flickered now and then, making the overhead lights buzz and dim. I sat in the operations room, nursing a mug of coffee, scrolling through my phone in search of anything to pass the time. The heater groaned, fighting a losing battle against the icy air. At around midnight, a sharp beat jolted me upright. I looked at the console. A radar screen that hadn't lit up in months was now glowing faintly, its circular sweep illuminating the room in an eerie green light. What the hell? I muttered. I leaned over the console, adjusting a few knobs out of habit. The screen flickered and steadied, showing a single blip on the edge of its range. A cold shiver ran down my spine. This equipment wasn't connected to any active systems, at least, it shouldn't have been. I toggled the frequency, adjusting for interference, but the blip remained. It was moving, inching closer to the center of the screen. Must be a glitch, I told myself, though my voice wavered. But as I stared at the blip, my stomach tightened. It moved with precision, not like random interference. Something, or someone, was out there. I brought up the base's ancient communication system and attempted a ping. Static. I tried again. This is Radar Station Echo requesting identification from nearby aircraft. Over. No response. I watched the screen as the blip moved closer. It was almost mesmerizing, the steady rhythm of its approach. Then, as I adjusted the frequency again, a grainy image flickered onto one of the auxiliary monitors, a thermal camera feed connected to the radar system. At first, it was hard to make out. A shape against the snowy backdrop, silhouetted in the dim glow of the radar. Slowly, the image sharpened. It was a plane. My heart raced as I leaned closer. The plane was old, its outline unmistakable. A propeller-driven aircraft, the kind you'd expect to see in black and white war footage. But what caught my breath was the tail number stenciled faintly on its fuselage, Flight 412. I recognized it immediately. Everyone in this part of Colorado knew the story of Flight 412. It had been a military transport plane that disappeared over the Rockies in 1965, never to be found. The official report blamed the weather, but locals whispered about stranger explanations, alien abduction, government cover-ups, or curses tied to the mountains. I stared at the monitor, my mind racing. It couldn't be the same plane. Could it? The radar blip moved closer, almost to the center of the screen now. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the screen flickered, and the image distorted into static. Damn it, I muttered, tapping the console. The room fell eerily silent except for the hum of the heater. A faint noise broke the quiet, a rhythmic thumping, barely audible over the wind. Footsteps. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The sound came from the corridor outside the operations room, slow and deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight from my desk and stood, hard hammering in my chest. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing down the empty hall. No answer. I stepped into the corridor, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The base was a patchwork of dimly lit spaces and shadowed corners, its fluorescent lights flickering weakly against the storm outside. The footsteps grew louder, coming from further down the hall. I followed, my boots crunching against the grit-covered floor. "Who's there?" Still no response. The footsteps stopped suddenly, replaced by a new sound, a faint tapping against one of the windows overlooking the radar tower. I approached cautiously, my breath visible in the frigid air. The window was fogged, but I could just make out the snowy landscape beyond. The radar tower loomed in the distance, its skeletal frame barely visible through the storm. Tap. 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 The noise was soft, almost polite. I shone my flashlight at the window but saw nothing unusual. Then, in the reflection, I noticed something behind me. A shadow. I spun around, but the corridor was empty. I hurried back to the operations room, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. My pulse raced as I scanned the monitors, hoping for some rational explanation. The radar screen had gone dark, but the auxiliary monitor flickered to life again, displaying the thermal feed. My stomach sank. The plane was closer now, nearly overhead. The monitor buzzed, and the image distorted, replaced by static. Then, faintly, a voice crackled through the speaker. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Flight 412. I stared at the console, my hands trembling. The voice was weak, filled with static, but unmistakable. "This is Flight 412, requesting clearance. Repeat, requesting clearance." The transmission cut out, replaced by a low, droning hum. Suddenly, the power flickered, and the lights in the room dimmed. The heater sputtered and died, leaving the air icy and still. Then I heard it again, the footsteps. This time, the footsteps were closer, heavier, and accompanied by a faint scraping sound. I shone my flashlight toward the door, half expecting it to burst open. The doorknob rattled. I backed away, my heart pounding. The rattling stopped, replaced by a steady knocking. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The knocking continued, relentless and mechanical. Then, without warning, it stopped. Silence. I approached the door cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to run. Slowly, I unlocked it and pulled it open. The corridor was empty. But something was wrong. The air was colder than before, and the walls seemed darker, the shadows deeper. At the far end of the hall, near the stairwell leading to the radar tower, a figure stood. It was a man in a military uniform, his features obscured by the dim light. His posture was rigid, his gaze fixed on me. "Who are you?" I called out. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked toward the stairwell, his movements unnaturally stiff. Against my better judgment, I followed. The stairwell was freezing, each step coated in a thin layer of ice. My flashlight flickered as I ascended, the beam struggling against the darkness. When I reached the top, the radar tower loomed before me, its antennae stretching into the stormy sky. The wind howled, rattling the structure. The man in the uniform stood near the edge of the platform, staring into the distance. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice barely audible over the storm. "What's going on? Are you with Flight 412? He turned slowly, and my breath caught in my throat. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and sunken. Frost clung to his hair and eyebrows, and his lips were tinged blue. "We never landed," he said, his voice hollow and distant. "We've been flying for so long." Behind him, the storm seemed to part, revealing the faint outline of the plane, its engines glowing faintly in the night. The man took a step toward me, his expression unreadable. "You have to come with us," he said. "No," I stammered, backing away. "I'm not going anywhere." But as I retreated, more figures emerged from the shadows of the tower. Men and women in tattered uniforms, their faces etched with frostbite and despair. "You have to come with us," they whispered in unison. I turned and ran, my boots slipping on the icy stairs. The figure's whispers followed me, growing louder and more frantic. By the time I reached the operations room, I was gasping for breath. The radar screen flickered again, displaying the blip one last time before going dark. The whispers faded, replaced by the hum of the heater sputtering back to life. The light steadied, and the room felt normal. But outside, the storm raged on, and I knew they were still out there, waiting. I left the base the next morning, breaking protocol to drive down the mountain before my shift ended. I didn't care. I couldn't stay there another night. I never told anyone what happened. The official log showed no anomalies, no record of the radar activating or the transmission from Flight 412. But sometimes, on cold winter nights, I hear the faint hum of propeller engines overhead, and I wonder if they're still flying, searching for someone to join them on their endless journey through the storm. Story number 4. Shadows of Waverly. If you've ever spent a night alone in an empty building, you know that silence can become a sound. It fills the air, presses against your ears, and seems to grow louder the longer it lasts. At Waverly Hills Sanatorium, silence wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, one that seemed to slither through the halls, brushing against you when you weren't looking. I should have known better when I took the job as a night security guard. Waverly Hills wasn't just any abandoned building. It was one of the most infamous haunted locations in the country, a place where thousands of tuberculosis patients had once fought for their lives and lost. The stories of ghosts, screams in the night, and shadowy figures were practically a tourist attraction. I didn't believe in any of it. Not back then. Now, I wish I'd listened. It was mid-December when I started. The air was brutally cold, biting through my jacket as I stepped out of my car and into the parking lot. Waverly Hills loomed ahead of me, a hulking, crumbling structure silhouetted against a sky heavy with snow clouds. Its windows were dark, its facade cracked with decades of neglect. Just a building, I muttered to myself, shoving my hands deeper into my pockets. The owners had hired me to watch the place during the off-season, keep out vandals, and report any signs of damage. Easy money, they said. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I set up in the small security office on the ground floor, which had been converted from an old storage room. A single desk, a set of security monitors, and a space heater were all I had for company. The building's interior was a labyrinth of long, dark corridors, peeling paint, and empty patient rooms. Every floor looked the same, rows of doorways leading to nothing but shadows. The owners had installed cameras in a few key areas, but the coverage was spotty at best, and the feeds flickered constantly, as if the building itself was interfering. Around midnight, the first glitch happened. The lights in the office flickered, then dimmed. The monitors fuzzed with static before stabilizing. I leaned forward, squinting at one of the feeds, the second floor, where an old nurse's station stood abandoned. Something moved. It was subtle, just a shadow slipping across the hallway, too quick to identify. My stomach tightened. A raccoon, I told myself. Maybe a stray cat. Grabbing my flashlight, I decided to check it out. The stairs creaked under my boots as I climbed. The air grew colder with each step, the chill sinking into my bones. My breath fogged the beam of my flashlight as I reached the second floor. The hallway stretched before me, dim and endless. The nurse's station was a shadowy alcove halfway down, its counters covered in dust. I swept my flashlight across the walls, the doors, the cracked tiles. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing. Nothing. I stepped closer to the station, my footsteps muffled by layers of grime and decay. The flashlight revealed broken furniture, a few scattered papers, and nothing else. The shadow I'd seen on the monitor was gone. As I turned to leave, I heard it. A faint tapping sound, coming from the far end of the hallway. I froze, heart pounding. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like knuckles rapping against a wooden door. "Is someone there?" I shouted, my voice breaking the silence. The tapping stopped. Then, a low creak echoed through the hall, as if a door was opening. My flashlight beam wavered as I aimed it toward the source of the noise. "Just an old building," I muttered, though my hands trembled. Nothing but wind and warped wood. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, though the uneasy feeling never left me. The next night, it got worse. The glitches started earlier this time, flickering lights, static-filled monitors. One feed in particular, covering the third floor, showed strange distortions. The screen seemed to ripple, as though something was moving just beyond the camera's field of view. I debated ignoring it, but duty won out. With flashlight in hand, I climbed the stairs to the third floor. This hallway felt different. The air was heavier, almost oppressive, and the silence was deafening. I checked each room as I passed, shining my light into the empty spaces. About halfway down the corridor, I saw it. A figure, standing at the end of the hall, barely illuminated by the weak beam of my flashlight. It was tall and motionless, draped in what looked like a long, tattered robe or hospital gown. "Hey!" I called, gripping the flashlight tighter. "You're trespassing. You need to leave." The figure didn't move. I took a cautious step forward, then another. My boots scraped against the tile, each sound magnified in the stillness. When I reached the spot where the figure had stood, it was gone. The hallway stretched on, empty. A faint whisper brushed against my ear, too soft to make out. I spun around, but there was no one there. By the end of the week, I was exhausted. Sleep was elusive, my dreams plagued by images of shadowy figures and endless hallways. I considered quitting but couldn't bring myself to admit defeat. The final night began like the others. The glitches, the shadows on the monitors, the unshakable feeling of being watched. But this time, the activity seemed to center on one place, the basement. The basement of Waverly Hills was infamous. It had once housed the sanatorium's morgue and body chute, a tunnel used to discreetly transport the dead out of the hospital. Even in daylight, it was a place no one wanted to enter. Now, staring at the static-filled monitor, I felt a growing dread. A faint movement caught my eye, a shadow slipping through the hallway leading to the morgue. I didn't want to go, but I knew I had to. The stairs leading to the basement were steep and narrow, the air growing colder with each step. By the time I reached the bottom, my breath was visible in the dim light. The flashlight beam wavered as I stepped into the main corridor. The walls were lined with rusted equipment, broken gurneys, and old medical tools. The smell of mildew and decay was overpowering. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. The morgue door was slightly ajar, its hinges creaking as I pushed it open. The room beyond was small and claustrophobic, dominated by a row of metal drawers once used to store bodies. As I stepped inside, the lights flickered again, casting the room in brief, strobe-like flashes. In one of those flashes, I saw them. Figures. Dozens of them, standing in the corners, their faces obscured by shadows. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. When the light steadied, the room was empty. A low whisper filled the air, growing louder until it became a chorus. "They're waiting," the voices said in unison. I didn't wait to find out what they meant. I bolted from the morgue, my footsteps echoing in the narrow corridor. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more urgent. By the time I reached the stairs, the lights had gone out completely. The darkness was suffocating, my flashlight the only source of illumination. I climbed as fast as I could, my legs burning with effort. The whispers turned to screams, echoing through the stairwell. When I burst into the main floor, the noise stopped. The building was silent again, the light steady. But I could still feel their presence, watching from the shadows. I didn't bother locking up. I grabbed my jacket, sprinted to my car, and didn't look back. I quit the next day. The owners were annoyed but didn't press for details. I wasn't the first guard to leave suddenly, and I wouldn't be the last. I don't know what I saw in Waverly Hills, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint tapping of footsteps, and I wonder if they followed me home. Story number 4. Cursed Shadows of Bodie. I've worked my share of strange jobs, but the night shift as a caretaker at the warehouse in Bodie, California, a ghost town frozen in time, was the strangest. And the most terrifying. Bodie was once a thriving mining town during the gold rush, but time had hollowed it out, leaving behind dilapidated buildings, rusted mining equipment, and an unsettling stillness. The state of California had preserved it as a historical park, frozen in a state of arrested decay. Tourists flocked there during the summer to snap photos of the ghost town, but winter was a different story. When the snow rolled in, Bodie became a place no one wanted to linger. The locals in nearby Bridgeport warned me when I took the job. Everyone had a story about the Bodie curse. Supposedly, anyone who dared to steal so much as a nail or a rock from the ghost town would be plagued by misfortune. Visitors occasionally mailed back stolen artifacts with apologetic notes, desperate to lift the curse after suffering car accidents, divorces, or worse. I didn't believe in curses. Not then. The job was straightforward: monitor the warehouse at the edge of town, make sure no vandals or looters snuck in, and ensure the structural integrity of the old building. It wasn't glamorous, but the pay was decent, and I liked the solitude. I didn't mind the creaky floorboards, the drafty windows, or the oppressive silence. At least, not at first. But that winter, Bodie felt different. The wind was relentless, rattling the warehouse's ancient windows and howling through the gaps in the wooden walls. The temperature had plummeted, frosting the inside of the glass and making my breath visible even indoors. I'd set up in a small office near the back of the warehouse, surrounded by dusty ledgers, outdated security monitors, and a clunky space heater that barely fought off the cold. The warehouse itself was massive, filled with relics from Bodie's heyday, mining tools, old furniture, barrels, and crates stacked like forgotten memories. It was the kind of place where every sound echoed, every shadow seemed to move. Around midnight, the first alarm went off. A sharp beep jolted me from my half-asleep state. I leaned over the monitors, scanning the grainy black and white feeds. The cameras weren't great, but they covered most of the warehouse's interior. On one of the screens, I saw it: a crate in the far corner had been moved. I frowned, rubbing my eyes. The crate had been part of a carefully arranged display of mining equipment, untouched for years. There was no way it could have shifted on its own. Grabbing my flashlight, I ventured out into the warehouse. The air inside was even colder than in the office, and the floorboards creaked under my boots. My flashlight beam sliced through the shadows, revealing rows of dust-covered artifacts. When I reached the far corner, the crate was exactly where I'd seen it on the monitor, pushed several feet from its original spot. But there were no footprints in the dust, no sign of anyone else in the building. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran down my spine. I returned to the office, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe it was a rodent or a trick of the wind. Old buildings like this had a way of playing tricks on your senses. An hour later, the alarm went off again. This time, it wasn't just a single beep. The motion detectors in 3 separate sections of the warehouse triggered in rapid succession. I stared at the monitors, my stomach knotting. On one of the screens, I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow slipping between the rows of crates. It was too quick, too indistinct to identify, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. "Hello?" I called out as I stepped into the main warehouse, my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. "If someone's in here, you need to leave. This is private property." No response. Just the wind howling against the walls. The warehouse felt larger and darker than before, the shadows stretching unnaturally. As I moved deeper into the building, I noticed something odd. Several objects had been disturbed. A wheelbarrow had been overturned, an antique lantern knocked from its hook. But there were still no footprints. Then I heard it. A faint voice, carried on the wind, whispering my name. "Jake." I froze, my breath hitching. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Who's there?" I shouted, spinning around. My voice echoed, but the whispering stopped. Back in the office, I locked the door and double-checked the cameras. The monitors flickered with static, but the feeds were clear enough to confirm what I'd feared. There was someone, or something, in the warehouse. On the screen, a figure moved between the crates, their silhouette barely visible. They were tall, their movements unnaturally slow and deliberate. I leaned closer, my heart pounding. The figure stopped suddenly, turning toward the camera. Though their face was obscured, I felt their gaze, cold and piercing, as if they could see me through the screen. Then the feed cut to static. The lights in the office flickered, and the space heater sputtered before going out. The temperature dropped sharply, and the room plunged into an icy stillness. Bang! The sound came from the warehouse floor, a loud, deliberate knock. I grabbed my flashlight and cracked open the office door, peering into the darkness. The voice came again, louder this time. "Jake, come outside." I should have stayed in the office, locked the door, and waited for dawn. But something about the voice compelled me. I stepped out into the warehouse, the cold biting at my skin. My flashlight barely seemed to cut through the darkness. "Jake." The voice was clearer now, coming from the main entrance. As I approached, the wind howled through the cracks in the walls, carrying faint whispers that sounded like overlapping voices. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The voice called again, softer this time, almost pleading. "Come outside." I opened the door. The storm hit me like a wall, snow swirling in the air and stinging my face. The wind was deafening, yet beneath it, I could still hear the whispers, growing louder and more insistent. In the distance, near the edge of the warehouse's floodlight, I saw a figure. They stood perfectly still, their outline barely visible through the snow. They were cloaked in shadow, their features obscured. "Who are you?" I shouted, but the wind swallowed my words. The figure raised an arm, pointing toward me. I stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut and bolting it. My heart raced as I backed away, every instinct screaming at me to run. The lights flickered again, and the cameras buzzed with static. On the monitor, the figure was no longer outside. They were inside. Standing in the middle of the warehouse, their head tilted slightly as if watching me. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't real." The figure took a step forward. The office lights went out, plunging me into darkness. I don't remember much of what happened next. I grabbed my keys, bolted out of the office, and ran through the warehouse, my flashlight swinging wildly. The whispers followed me, growing louder, overlapping into a cacophony. By the time I reached my truck, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the parking lot, not daring to look back. As I sped down the snow-covered road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure stood at the edge of the warehouse's light, watching me leave. I quit the next day. I told my supervisor I couldn't do it anymore, and he didn't argue. He'd heard similar stories before. To this day, I can't explain what I saw in Bodie. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear the wind whisper my name, and I remember the figure in the snow. I haven't been back to Bodie since. And I never will.